Look at this house. 5,200 square feet. 4 bedrooms. 5.5 bathrooms. A 3-car garage that eats the entire front elevation like a mouth. A turret? Yes, a turret. On a house in a subdivision 40 minutes outside Columbus, Ohio. That serves no purpose except to say, from the street, we have arrived. It has a roofline with 6 different pitches, none of which relate to each other, all of which exist because somewhere in a design catalog in 2004, dynamic roof lines tested well with focus groups. It has fake stone on the bottom third of the facade and vinyl siding on the top 2/3, because stone is expensive and nobody looks up. It has a 2-story entryway with a chandelier hanging in a stairwell that no one has ever paused to admire, because the moment you walk in, you're already being funneled past a curved staircase toward a great room with 18-foot ceilings that will cost a fortune to heat for the rest of this house's natural life. This is a McMansion, and for about 20 years, it was the physical shape of the American dream. We're going to spend the next half hour taking this house apart, literally, structurally, financially, culturally, because I think if you understand what a McMansion actually is, you understand something much bigger. You understand how a country convinced an entire generation that the good life was measured in square footage. You understand how an economy quietly became a machine for building debt-shaped like houses. And you understand why, 20 years later, the kids who grew up in these homes want absolutely nothing to do with them. So let's start at the beginning. Not 2004, 1945. After the Second World War, the United States had a housing crisis. 16 million soldiers were coming home, many of them starting families, and there simply weren't enough places for them to live. The solution was Levittown, and places like it all across the country. A radical experiment in building housing the way Henry Ford built cars. The original Levittown houses were about 750 square feet, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a living room, a kitchen, no garage, no basement in a lot of them. They were, by today's standards, almost comically small. You could fit 3 of them inside our turreted friend from the cold open. But here's the thing. These houses worked. They worked because they were honest about what they were. A modest box, built efficiently, sold affordably, designed to house a family, not to perform wealth for the neighbors. The American dream, in its original 1950s formulation, was not as much house as the bank will let you borrow. It was a stable job, a small home you could actually pay off, and a yard for the kids. For about 50 years, the average American home grew slowly and rationally. In 1950, the average new single-family home in the U.S. was around 983 square feet. By 1970, it had grown to about 1,500. Families were, on average, getting slightly smaller over this period. But houses kept growing. That's the first crack in the logic, and we'll come back to it. Then something happens in the data around 1995. The line doesn't just rise, it takes off. By 2007, the average new American home hit an all-time high of about 2,500 square feet. For a national household size that had shrunk to just 2.6 people, we were building emptier and emptier houses, and filling them with fewer and fewer people. We were about to enter the golden age of the McMansion. Let's define our terms, because McMansion gets thrown around as a general insult for big house I don't like, and that's not quite fair. Bigness alone isn't the sin. There are enormous homes, real mansions, that are genuinely beautiful. Proportion, materials, and craftsmanship separate a mansion from a McMansion. A McMansion is not just a big house. It's a big house built cheap, built fast, and built to look expensive from the street without actually being expensive anywhere the eye doesn't immediately land. The name itself tells you everything. It's fast food architecture, supersized, standardized, mass-produced, and designed to be consumed quickly. From a car window by a buyer, driving through a subdivision on a Sunday afternoon with a real estate agent. So let's do the anatomy. Let's actually take this thing apart. Look at the roof. A well-designed house has a roofline that expresses the logic of the rooms underneath it. The shape on top tells you something true about the shape inside. A McMansion roof does the opposite. It's what architects call roof spam. Gable after gable after gable, jammed together with no relationship to the floor plan below, purely because more gables read as more expensive on a real estate listing photo. Architectural critic Kate Wagner, who runs the blog McMansion Hell, has spent a decade cataloging these homes, and one of her sharpest observations is that these roofs aren't functional. They're decorative noise, visual complexity mistaken for visual richness. Then you walk in, and you're standing in what design critics call, only half-jokingly, the lawyer foyer, a two-story entry hall that exists purely to announce grandeur. It's dead volume. It's air you have to heat and cool, square footage you're paying a mortgage on, that serves no functional purpose except to make the first 4 seconds of a house tour feel expensive. It's the architectural equivalent of a car engine revving in neutral. A lot of dramatic sound, zero forward motion. Next, look at the front of the house from the street. In a huge number of these homes, the single largest architectural feature facing the public street is not the front door, it's the garage. 2, sometimes 3 bays, jutting forward, dominating the facade. We built an entire generation of homes whose primary design statement to the world was, "Look at where I park my cars." And now the part that really matters, because this is where the cheapness stops being an aesthetic problem and becomes a physical one. The materials, real stone, real brick, real stucco, these are expensive, heavy, and slow to install. So developers turn to synthetic substitutes. EIFS, exterior insulation and finish system, is a thin layer of synthetic plaster over foam board, styled to look like real stucco from 20 feet away. Manufactured stone veneer is a lightweight concrete product, cast in molds, glued onto the lower third of a facade. Always just the lower third, because that's the money zone the eye registers as expensive. While the upper stories get cheap vinyl siding that will fade, crack and warp within a couple of decades. These materials aren't just cosmetically dishonest. EIFS in particular became infamous through the 1990s and 2000s for trapping moisture inside wall cavities, leading to hidden rot and mold. A nationwide wave of lawsuits followed. The house that was built to look solid from the street was, in a meaningful number of cases, quietly rotting behind the fake stone. This is the core architectural sin of the McMansion, and it's worth sitting with, because it's also the core economic sin, and eventually the core cultural one. It's a building designed to communicate a value it does not possess. It is a stage set of wealth, built on the frame of a budget. And that's not an accident of bad taste. It was a business model. To understand why American developers, roughly starting in the mid-1990s and exploding through the 2000s, decided the answer to every housing question was bigger. You have to stop thinking about houses as shelter and start thinking about them as what they had become, a financial product. Here's the math from the developer's side, and it's brutally simple. The most expensive part of building a house is not the house. It's the land, the site development, the roads, the sewer lines, the permits, the fixed costs that exist whether you build a small home or a large one on that lot. Once a developer has paid for the land and run the utilities, adding another 1,000 square feet of framing, drywall, and vinyl siding is relatively cheap. But that extra square footage sells for real money. So the economics push hard. toward maximum size. A modest, well-built 1,800 square foot home with real materials and thoughtful proportions is less profitable per lot than a 4,000 square foot vinyl and foam colossus with a lawyer foyer and a turret. Scale up, cheap but big, across an entire subdivision of 300 homes, and you understand why. By the 2000s, nearly every production home builder in the country converged on the same formula. This is the paradox we flagged earlier, and now you have the answer to it. Houses got bigger while families got smaller, because the house had stopped being sized to the family. It had started being sized to the loan. And these houses needed somewhere to go, which meant somewhere cheap, which meant the edge of everything. Farmland on the outskirts of metro areas was inexpensive, unzoned, and easy to grade into a curvilinear street pattern of cul-de-sac. So the McMansion didn't just define a building. It defined a geography. Sprawl, subdivisions with names like Eagle's Landing, or Whispering Meadows, built on land that 6 months earlier had been an actual meadow with actual eagles, now scraped flat and gridded into half-acre lots, connected to civilization by a single collector road, funneling everyone into the same Applebee's parking lot. This was not walkable. It was not served by transit. It required by design that every single errand, school, groceries, work, a gallon of milk, happen by car. The three-car garage wasn't a luxury flourish. It was structurally necessary infrastructure for a household that could not function without 3 cars, because the neighborhood itself refused to function without them. Now add the financial accelerant. Starting in the late 1990s and intensifying dramatically after 2001, mortgage lending standards in the U.S. loosened at a pace that, in hindsight, looks almost like satire. Subprime mortgages, loans issued to borrowers with weak credit, unstable income or minimal documentation, went from a marginal corner of the lending industry to a massive share of it. No income, no job, no assets loans, dryly nicknamed ninja loans by the industry itself, became common enough to have their own slang. Why would a lender do this? Because of something called securitization. Banks weren't holding on to these risky mortgages and hoping borrowers paid them back over 30 years. They were bundling thousands of mortgages together into mortgage-backed securities, slicing those into tranches, getting them rated, often too generously, by credit agencies, and selling them off to investors around the world. The risk of any single McMansion buyer defaulting got diffused into a global financial soup, which meant, from the lender's point of view, the actual creditworthiness of the person signing for a $600,000 house on a $45,000 salary mattered less and less. The loan wasn't a bet on that family. It was a product, moving down an assembly line. And the moment it was sold off, it became someone else's problem. This is the part that connects the architecture directly to the economy. And it's the thesis of this whole video. So let me say it plainly. The McMansion was never really designed to be lived in for 30 years. It was designed to be financed. It existed, in huge numbers, as a vehicle for a mortgage, which was itself a vehicle for a security, which was itself a vehicle for a bet, layered upon a bet, and the actual physical building, sitting out there on its half-acre lot with its foam stone and its lawyer foyer, was almost incidental, a receipt for a transaction, shaped like a home. That's why the corners got cut. Nobody securitizing a mortgage-backed bond cared whether the EIFS was installed correctly. The building only had to look like $600,000 for about as long as it took to close the sale and originate the next loan. And homebuyers, for their part, were not just buying shelter anymore either. Culturally, by the mid-2000s, a huge number of Americans had absorbed the idea that a house was not a place you lived. It was an appreciating asset you traded up. Buy the McMansion with an adjustable rate mortgage you can barely afford now, because in 18 months, the market will have appreciated enough to refinance, pull out equity, maybe flip it for a profit. Home equity became a kind of ATM. People weren't just living in these gigantic living rooms. They were living financially, inside their own collateral. It's worth pausing here to say, this wasn't really greed in the cartoonish sense, at least not on the buyer's end. It was the entirely rational response of ordinary families to 20 years of cultural messaging that told them a house was the safest investment on earth, that home prices only go up, and that not buying as much house as you could qualify for was, in some sense, leaving money on the table. The system was built to make the biggest, riskiest choice feel like the responsible one. We all know how that story ends. By 2007, the math finally broke. Adjustable rate mortgages reset to higher payments. Home prices, which were never supposed to fall, fell. Borrowers who'd been counting on refinancing their way out of trouble found there was no equity left to refinance with. Foreclosures spiked. The mortgage-backed securities that Wall Street had rated as safe turned out to be, in a lot of cases, built on loans that should never have been issued in the first place. Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008. The global financial system seized up almost overnight. And out on the literal edges of American metro areas, in the newest, farthest-flung subdivisions, the ones built last, sold last, financed with the loosest lending, the McMansion dream simply stopped mid-sentence. These became known in the press at the time as ghost subdivisions. Places like parts of Florida, inland California, Nevada, and Arizona, the hottest sprawl markets of the boom, were suddenly dotted with developments where the roads were paved, the street signs were up, the sewer lines were laid, and maybe a third of the lots actually had houses on them, some of those abandoned mid-construction, wrapped in Tyvek that flapped in the wind for years because there was no buyer left to finish the sale. It's an eerie, almost apocalyptic image. Infrastructure for a community that never arrived. Streetlights illuminating empty grass. Cul-de-sacs built for imaginary children who would never learn to ride bikes on them. It is, in a strange way, the most honest thing the McMansion era ever produced. Proof that these places were never really neighborhoods in the traditional sense. They were financial instruments that occasionally, when the market cooperated, happened to have families living inside them. There's a second, quieter collapse that gets less attention than the financial one, and it's still ongoing. These houses are extraordinarily wasteful to actually operate. That two-story great room with the 18-foot ceilings isn't just an aesthetic indulgence. It's a massive volume of conditioned air that a standard HVAC system has to constantly reheat or recool. The complex multi-gabled rooflines create dozens of extra seams and valleys, which are exactly where insulation gaps and air leaks tend to happen. The cheap, thin building envelope, that foam-backed synthetic stucco, has nowhere near the thermal mass of real masonry. The result is a category of home that, per square foot, is often dramatically less energy efficient than either the smaller post-war houses that preceded it, or the more thoughtfully engineered, high-performance homes being built today. You end up with families paying enormous heating and cooling bills to condition rooms, like that lawyer foyer, that are barely ever used. It's a house that costs a fortune to keep merely existing, independent of anyone living in it. And zoom out further, and the environmental cost compounds. Sprawl development doesn't just waste energy inside the house. It mandates car dependency for every trip outside it. It pushes new construction onto farmland and habitat at the metro fringe, and it requires enormously expensive to maintain infrastructure. Miles of extra roads, water lines, and sewer pipe per household, compared to more compact development patterns. Some smart growth researchers and urban economists have argued for years that low-density sprawl development frequently doesn't even pay for its own infrastructure long-term through the property taxes it generates, meaning existing residents in older, denser parts of a city end up subsidizing the roads and pipes out to the new subdivisions at the edge. The McMansion, in other words, wasn't just a bad deal for the family living in it once the bills came due. It was, in aggregate, a bad deal for the whole metro area around it. Here's where this story gets personal, because a lot of people watching this grew up in one of these houses. Millennials and older Gen Z spent their childhoods in the great room, did homework in the lawyer foyer's shadow, rode bikes around the cul-de-sac of a subdivision, named after the woodland it had replaced, and now, as they've become the adults doing the buying, the data shows something striking. They don't want these houses back. Real estate surveys and market data through the 2010s and 2020s have consistently shown younger buyers gravitating toward smaller, more efficient homes and toward walkable urban and close-in suburban neighborhoods over the far-flung car-dependent subdivisions of the McMansion boom. Terms like starter home have almost vanished from the market, not because nobody wants a starter home, but because production builders spent 2 decades optimizing for the McMansion's fat margins and simply stopped building the small, entry-level houses that used to exist at scale. The market that made McMansions so profitable also quietly strangled the supply of anything smaller. At the same time, something almost like a cultural genre has emerged around mocking these houses. Kate Wagner's McMansion Hell blog, which we mentioned earlier, turned architectural criticism of Zillow listings into genuinely popular internet content. A generation scrolling through real estate photos of turrets and foam stone and captioning them with the same energy you'd use to review a bad meal. That mockery isn't just snark for its own sake. It's a generation processing a kind of inherited disappointment. They were told this was the dream. They watched their parents strain financially to buy into it. Some watched their families lose that house entirely in 2008. And now, as adults, they're rejecting both the aesthetic and the economic logic underneath it. But, and this is the darkly funny tragic twist, that rejection is running headlong into an entirely different housing crisis. Because while millennials and Gen Z largely don't want the McMansion, they're finding it nearly impossible to get the modest, walkable, well-built alternative either. Decades of zoning laws written specifically to make McMansion-style, single-family, large-lot subdivisions the only legal thing to build in huge swaths of American metro areas mean that smaller multi-family housing, townhomes, or genuinely modest starter homes are often, quite literally, illegal to construct on most residential land in the country. The McMansion didn't just win the market in the 2000s. In a lot of places, it got written into the law. So, the generation that grew up mocking the great room and the turret now finds itself priced out of buying almost anything, stuck renting, watching home prices climb even as wages haven't kept pace, in a market where the affordable, smaller housing they'd actually want to buy was regulated out of existence a generation ago by the very zoning codes that made the McMansion boom possible in the first place. It's a strange, almost cruel inheritance. The dream got bigger, then it collapsed, and what's left standing on the other side isn't a return to something smaller and saner. It's scarcity, dressed up in the exact same vinyl siding. So, what do we actually do with this house? What does it mean, 20 years later, that this turreted, foam-stoned, lawyer-foyered, 3-garage bayed thing was, for a generation, the physical shape of success? I think the McMansion is one of the most honest artifacts American consumer culture has ever produced, precisely because it's dishonest. It's a building that tells you in its very construction what it was actually for. Not shelter primarily, not beauty certainly. It was built to signal, to communicate from the street, a level of arrival and success that the family inside may or may not have actually achieved. financed by debt that may or may not have ever been sustainable, on land that may or may not have made any sense to develop in the first place. And I think the quiet correction happening right now, smaller homes, renewed interest in walkable neighborhoods, the entire not-so-big house movement in architecture that emphasizes craft and proportion over sheer square footage, isn't really about nostalgia for the 1950s. Nobody's arguing we should go back to 750-square-foot Levittown boxes with one bathroom for a family of 5. It's about something more basic. The difference between a house that's honest about what it is and a house that's performing something it isn't. A well-built 1,600-square-foot home with real materials, a coherent roofline, rooms that are actually used, and a mortgage payment that doesn't require 2 incomes and a prayer. That's not a lesser version of the American dream. Arguably, it's a truer one. It's closer to what the original post-war promise actually was. Not the biggest house the bank will let you finance, but a stable, achievable, honestly built place to actually live your life. The McMansion asked a simple, seductive question, over and over, for about 15 years. What if bigger just meant better? We ran that experiment at scale, across an entire country. We financed it with loans we couldn't always pay back, built it out of materials that couldn't always hold up, and sold it as a dream that, for a lot of families, ended in a foreclosure notice stapled to a front door with a turret over it. Maybe the real dream was never about square footage at all. Maybe it was just about having a door that's honestly yours to close, on a house that doesn't need to lie about what's holding it up.